During what would become one of the most explosive press conferences of his presidency, Donald Trump stood before reporters clutching what he believed was political dynamite, a secret recording that would finally expose Barack Obama as unfit for leadership. But as the tape rolled through those packed White House speakers, the room didn't gasp in shock. Instead, it fell into stunned silence for reasons Trump never saw coming. What he intended as Obama's political burial became something entirely different, a stark reminder of the leadership voice America had been missing. The White House press briefing room crackled with electric tension long before President Trump's arrival. Reporters gripped their notebooks tighter than usual. Cameras operators adjusted their lenses with nervous precision, and seasoned correspondents who had witnessed countless political theatrics sensed something unprecedented brewing in the air. When Trump finally strode to the podium, his usual swagger carried an extra edge of confidence. His opening salvo bypassed pleasantries entirely. "Barack Obama," Trump declared, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, was unfit to lead this nation then, and remains unfit to influence it. Now the words landed with surgical precision, sending a visible ripple through the assembled press corps. Journalists exchanged lightning-quick glances, eyebrows arching, pens hovering mid-sentence, while Trump had launched attacks on his predecessor. Before this moment carried a different weight, an unmistakable promise that something seismic was about to unfold. From the front row, Sarah Chen of the Washington Post leaned forward, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet. "Mr. President, are you suggesting the former president is actively undermining your administration?" Trump's expression hardened, his jaw setting into that familiar defiant line. "That's precisely what I'm saying," he replied slowly, savoring each word. "People have no idea how deep this goes. He's been sabotaging everything we've built, but today you'll hear the proof straight from his own mouth." The briefing room transformed into a vacuum of anticipation. Not a cough echoed, not a chair creaked, just the weight of collective breath being held. Reporters understood they were perched on the precipice of a story that could reshape political narratives in every direction. Trump pivoted slightly, gesturing toward an aide stationed just off stage. A laptop materialized, carried forward with ceremonial gravity, and positioned carefully on the presidential podium. Trump tapped the microphone once, the sound reverberating through the tense space, then leaned close to the device. "We have a recording," he announced, his satisfaction barely contained. "It's Obama himself speaking. His true thoughts. You'll understand exactly what I mean." The press corps sat frozen, some holding their breath, others scribbling frantically, desperate to capture every syllable. The anticipation had grown so thick it seemed to press against their chests like a physical force. From the third row, Michael Rodriguez of NBC News whispered urgently to his colleague. "This could reshape everything." His companion could only shake his head, eyes locked on the podium, unable to look away. Trump surveyed the room, drinking in the moment of supreme control for years. "I've warned everyone," he continued. "Obama never possessed the strength to lead America. He never deserved to guide this nation. But don't take my word for it. Listen to his own confession with theatrical precision." Trump pressed a button on the laptop. The speakers sparked to life, initially offering nothing but static crackle. Then gradually a voice emerged from the electronic haze, unmistakable in its calm, measured cadence. "Barack Obama. Thank you all for joining me today." Obama's voice began flowing through the speakers. "I understand times feel uncertain, and many of you question whether your individual efforts truly matter. But I'm here to tell you with absolute certainty they do. Every conversation you initiate, every young person you guide, every moment you remind someone that this country belongs to all of us. You're actively shaping our collective future." Confusion rippled through the press corps like a stone dropped in still water. This wasn't the explosive revelation they had braced themselves for. It didn't sound scandalous or treacherous. It sounded distinctly presidential. Trump stood with arms folded across his chest, radiating confidence that the recording would validate his accusations. But the words flowing from those speakers carried an entirely different energy, something that felt less like betrayal and more like inspiration. A journalist near the back whispered urgently, "Where's the attack? Where's the evidence of undermining?" But Obama's voice continued steady and reassuring. weaving a narrative about community leaders in Detroit, about resilience in the face of adversity, about teaching young Americans that democracy wasn't a gift handed down from previous generations, but something that required constant nurturing, protection, and active participation. The contrast hit the room like a wave in that space filled with political tension and breathless expectation. Reporters found themselves listening not to an indictment of character, but to a masterclass in leadership. One cameraman, typically stone-faced during even the most dramatic political theater, quietly murmured under his breath, "This is actually moving the press corps accustomed to sharp-edged rhetoric and theatrical confrontations suddenly found themselves caught in a moment they hadn't anticipated. Instead of scandal, there was genuine inspiration. Instead of evidence of betrayal, there was a clear call for national unity. Yet Trump didn't interrupt the playback. He allowed the tape to continue rolling, his expression unreadable, almost daring the assembled media to interpret Obama's words the way he insisted they should. But those words carried their own undeniable weight, painting a picture that no amount of political framing could distort or manipulate. By the time Obama's voice reached the segment where he declared our democracy survives not because of any single leader, but because millions of voices refuse to abandon hope in one another, the entire energy of the briefing room had shifted dramatically. Reporters weren't frantically scribbling notes anymore. They were simply listening, absorbed in spite of themselves. The irony was impossible to ignore. What Trump had presented as definitive proof of unfitness struck many ears as exactly the opposite. CNN correspondent Maria Santos whispered to her neighbor, "If this represents his strongest evidence, this strategy might completely backfire." Her colleague nodded silently. Mesmerized by the unfolding spectacle, the recording continued, and the press corps leaned deeper into Obama's message, each person acutely aware that the day's story was already writing itself in ways none of them had predicted. But the real shock was still approaching, something that would send this narrative spinning into completely uncharted territory. The speakers continued carrying Obama's words with crystal clarity, his tone remaining steady and purposeful. He wasn't shouting accusations at anyone. He wasn't launching political attacks. He was guiding like an experienced teacher who understood his students needed encouragement more than criticism. Trump, maintaining his rigid posture at the podium, scanned the crowd of reporters, expecting gasps of outrage, perhaps even confirmation of his serious accusations. Instead, he encountered furrowed brows, skeptical expressions, and pens that had slowed to a near standstill. The recording didn't sound incriminating. In any way, it sounded undeniably presidential. Obama's voice flowed onward. "The strength of our nation isn't measured by the titles held by people in office. It's measured by neighbors in Flint who check on each other during crises, by teachers in Detroit who refuse to abandon their students, by parents in Milwaukee who work multiple jobs just to keep their families stable." These words settled heavily in the room. For many reporters, it became impossible not to recall Obama's speeches from years past, those addresses that had elevated him to national prominence. That distinctive rhythm, that unshakable calm. It was unmistakably his voice. But Trump, unwilling to break his intense gaze, leaned back into the microphone. "You hear that he barked. That reveals his true philosophy. He doesn't believe in strong, decisive leadership. He believes in weak communities. He thinks others should run the country instead of the people we actually elect." Hands shot up from the front section. Rebecca Lynn from the Boston Globe spoke carefully. "Mr. President, with all due respect, that doesn't sound like undermining. That sounds like genuine encouragement." Trump's face darkened visibly. "Encouragement equals weakness," he snapped. "We need strength in this country. We don't need lectures about neighbors and families. We need real leaders, and Obama has never qualified as one." The tension escalated noticeably. Reporters exchanged meaningful glances, some struggling to hide their surprise, others fighting to suppress knowing smirks. Meanwhile, the audio continued playing completely. Ignoring the heated commentary swirling around it on the recording, Obama was now responding to questions from young leaders during that gathering in Detroit months earlier. A young man's voice asked, What should we do when we feel powerless to create change? Mr. President, Obama's response came without any hesitation. You remind yourself that history has never been written by cynics. It's always been written by those who persist even when facing impossible odds. Meaningful change never comes easily. It requires patience, persistence, and above all, unwavering belief in each other. Several reporters in the briefing room lowered their pens entirely. They had stopped taking notes and were simply listening, absorbed, despite their professional skepticism. The words weren't breaking news. The recording had been made months earlier during a private session with community leaders. But in this charged moment, they felt vibrantly alive. Trump, however, showed no signs of wavering. He pointed an accusatory finger at the assembled press. You think that represents leadership? That's weakness talking pure and simple. That's a man trying to convince young people not to fight for real change, but to remain passive and compliant. This time, a voice from the back of the room cut through his words. Sir, with all due respect, that's not what it sounds like at all. It was Anthony Ross from Reuters. He's saying exactly the opposite. That persistence and dedication are absolutely necessary. Are you certain this is the correct clip to support your argument for the first time? A flicker of genuine frustration crossed Trump's features. He waved his hand dismissively. You people will twist absolutely anything to protect him. But the truth is, playing right here, on this tape for everyone to hear. Yet even as Trump spoke with increasing agitation, Obama's voice kept flowing from the speakers with unshakable composure. Leadership isn't about destroying others to prove your own strength. It's about elevating people so they can carry the torch of progress when you're no longer there to guide them. The words echoed through the cramped briefing room, and an audible murmur rippled through the crowd of assembled reporters. Some even raised their eyebrows, clearly impressed by what they were hearing. Trump's aides positioned along the wall looked increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't the reaction they had anticipated or prepared for. The recording was supposed to function as a devastating political weapon, but instead it felt like an unexpected gift, one that Obama had never intended for public consumption. But that was nonetheless resonating powerfully with everyone in that room. Rebecca Lynn, still gripping her pen, leaned over to a colleague and whispered quietly, "If anything, he just handed Obama the most valuable free publicity imaginable." Her colleague nodded silently, eyes remaining fixed on the laptop as Obama's voice delivered what felt like a final decisive blow, soft in delivery, but piercing in impact. America is not defined by the sum of its divisions. It's measured by how effectively we rise above them. Working together, the briefing room fell into complete silence again, and for a long suspended moment, the only sound was Obama's recorded voice continuing to play. Then, without any warning, Trump slapped the laptop closed with decisive force. The speakers went immediately dead enough. He declared firmly, "You've heard the evidence now. You understand the complete truth." But the silence filling the room wasn't agreement or validation. It was pure disbelief. Reporters looked at one another, uncertain whether Trump had any awareness of the irony he had just created. A journalist from Politico muttered under his breath, he might have just handed Obama the biggest public relations victory of the entire year. Trump gathered his notes, clearly ready to pivot to another topic. But the damage was already irreversible. Reporters weren't thinking about policy announcements or routine briefings anymore. Their minds were completely occupied by what they had just experienced. But the real shock wouldn't emerge from inside the press room. It would come from outside, where this recording was about to take on a completely independent life of its own. Within mere minutes of the press conference ending, video clips of the recording were already circulating across the internet with viral velocity. Reporters rushed out of the White House briefing room with phones pressed to their ears, laptops opening before they even reached their vehicles. In an era where a single sentence could trend globally in under 5 minutes, this represented pure political dynamite. But the explosion wasn't damaging Barack Obama. It was devastating. Trump cable networks scrambled into emergency mode. CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News interrupted regular programming to broadcast. The audio producers in glass-walled control rooms shouted urgent instructions. Get that clip on air immediately. Run it again. The Obama recording wasn't scandalous, it was eloquent, measured, and fundamentally American. That irony made it absolutely irresistible for continuous broadcast on MSNBC anchor. Joy Michaels leaned forward, intently listening to the playback, through her earpiece before speaking directly to camera. "That's not an indictment of Obama," she said carefully. "That's a vivid reminder of the kind of leadership we rarely hear anymore." Her co-anchor nodded thoughtfully, watching the words scroll across the teleprompter. But it wasn't only television that caught fire. Social media platforms exploded with unprecedented engagement. Twitter erupted with hashtags, #ObamaTape, and #LeadershipMatters, climbing rapidly to the top of trending lists, clips featuring Obama's voice declaring, "Leadership isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting people up." Were already being incorporated into TikTok videos paired with images of everyday Americans, teachers in Cleveland, classrooms, volunteers at Houston food banks, nurses working in Des Moines hospitals. On Instagram, a young woman from Phoenix posted her reaction saying, "Whatever you think about politics, these words still fill me with genuine hope." Thousands of comments flooded. And within minutes, many echoing identical sentiments. "This doesn't sound like unfitness. It sounds exactly like what we're missing in our current political landscape." Meanwhile, in living rooms across ordinary America, the reaction was deeply visceral and immediate. In Toledo, Ohio, 58-year-old truck driver Alan Pierce sat in his familiar recliner, remote control in hand, watching CNN replay the recording repeatedly. He shook his head slowly, speaking to his wife. "I didn't even vote for that guy back then," he muttered. "But damn if that doesn't sound like real leadership." His wife, Carol, continued folding laundry, but glanced up at the television screen. "Compared to what we've been hearing lately, it's like night and day," she observed quietly. Phoenix High School senior Danielle Morales sat cross-legged on her family couch, her phone buzzing constantly with notifications. She played the clip aloud for her mother, who was preparing dinner in the adjacent kitchen. "See, Mom, this is exactly what we were discussing in our government class. He's telling us that our voices actually matter." Her mother wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and paused to listen, her expression gradually softening. "He's not even president anymore," she said thoughtfully. "But he still sounds like one." The irony deepened exponentially. The very recording Trump had believed would destroy Obama was being embraced as a powerful reminder of dignity and steadiness in political leadership. The country wasn't hearing weakness. They were hearing hope, but not everyone was moved in the same positive direction. In a diner just off Route 66 in Amarillo, Texas, a group of older men wearing baseball caps leaned across their booth, engaged in heated debate. One slammed his coffee mug down so forcefully that foam spilled over the rim. "Don't you understand what's happening?" he said angrily. "They're trying to make him sound like a saint, but he's not one of us." Never was his quieter friend stirred his black coffee thoughtfully and replied, "Maybe not, but you have to admit the man knows how to speak. That's exactly why people listen to him." These conversations kept multiplying exponentially in barbershops, on college campuses, in factory lunchrooms across America. People argued passionately, but they argued because Obama's words had genuinely affected them. They were forced to decide what those words meant to them personally. Meanwhile, inside the White House, Trump's staff huddled anxiously in the West Wing, their faces reflecting growing concern. The clip had already aired on every major network, and polling analysts were warning that the optics were absolutely disastrous. "We essentially gave him a microphone," one aide said quietly, and somehow he managed to steal the entire room back at his home in Chicago. Obama hadn't yet spoken publicly about the incident, but those close to him indicated he wasn't particularly surprised. He had been addressing community leaders that day in Detroit with no expectation of national publicity. His words hadn't been crafted as political attacks. They were intended purely as encouragement. Now those same words were ricocheting across the country, finding new life in completely unexpected places. In Detroit, 23-year-old Malika Foster vividly remembered being in the audience when the tape was originally recorded. She posted a heartfelt video on Facebook. "I was physically present when he spoke those words," she explained emotionally. "He looked directly into our eyes. It didn't feel like politics, it felt like someone genuinely telling us not to give up on ourselves. And now the entire world gets to hear his message. Her video was shared thousands of times within hours. Even late-night television comedians joined the cultural conversation on his show. One grinning host leaned directly into the camera and quipped, "Trump tried to drop a political bomb on Obama, but it turned out to be a beautiful bouquet." Instead, the studio audience erupted in sustained laughter. By midnight, the story was no longer about whether Obama was unfit for leadership. It was about how Trump had managed to transform a routine speech into a viral moment that completely restored Obama's public image. Political analysts were calling it one of the most stunning strategic backfires in recent memory. But the true test wasn't in the headlines or social media hashtags. It was in how ordinary Americans would carry those words into their daily conversations and what they would ultimately mean for the political landscape going forward. The morning following the press conference, the White House briefing room still carried the lingering scent of stale coffee, and unresolved tension. Reporters filed in earlier than usual, buzzing with conversation about what they had witnessed. Some replayed the clip on their phones for colleagues who hadn't been present in the room, shaking their heads, as if they still couldn't process what they had experienced. For those who had been physically present, the moment had felt almost surreal. Trump, standing confidently, convinced he had finally exposed Barack Obama decisively, and then Obama's voice, calm, reflective, layered with the kind of steady composure people had grown to associate with genuine leadership, had filled that charged space, transforming expectation into something entirely different. In one corner, Laura Bennett from the Philadelphia Inquirer was explaining to her editor over the phone, "I need you to understand something." When that recording started playing, it was like the atmosphere itself shifted. We all expected something politically damaging, but it ended up sounding like a sermon on hope and perseverance. The recording had played for nearly 7 minutes before Trump abruptly terminated it. Yet, those 7 minutes replayed endlessly in the minds of everyone who had heard them. The sight of seasoned reporters leaning back in their chairs, exchanging bewildered glances, was almost as remarkable as Obama's actual words. Anthony Ross of Reuters would later recall in a detailed interview, it was genuinely the strangest thing usually in that room. When the president makes serious accusations, you get immediate chaos, questions, interruptions, challenges. But when Obama's voice filled the speakers, everything stopped. People just listened intently. Even within the room, some journalists couldn't help but react openly. Cameras captured Rebecca Lynn scribbling only 3 words in her notebook as the audio played. "This is leadership." That image was shared thousands of times across social platforms, her handwritten note becoming a meme that only amplified the unintended consequences of Trump's attempted attack. The shockwave extended far beyond those reporters. Cable news networks ran split screens throughout the night, replaying Obama's words on one side, while showing Trump's increasingly expressionless face on the other. Political pundits debated whether Trump had fundamentally misunderstood the recording or had been misled by aides who thought it sounded more damaging than it actually was. At a small coffee shop in Omaha, Nebraska, college students huddled around a laptop replaying the footage repeatedly. "Look at his expression," one student said, pointing at Trump on the screen. "He genuinely thinks he's delivering a knockout punch, but he's actually giving his opponent the spotlight." His friend shook her head in disbelief. "It's like handing your opponent the microphone in the middle of a debate." Inside the White House, aides scrambled desperately to control the rapidly deteriorating narrative. A press release was drafted before dawn, attempting to frame the recording as definitive proof that Obama was inappropriately interfering in current national affairs, but the language sounded forced and defensive by the time it reached inboxes across Washington. Journalists had already constructed their own narrative, interpretation. Trump's supposed smoking gun had actually become Obama's greatest unexpected gift. Even conservative commentators struggled to process the moment effectively. On a late-night radio show in Dallas, host Carl Denton admitted candidly, "I honestly don't know what the president was thinking. That didn't sound like a man undermining America. It sounded like someone trying to hold the country together." His callers were evenly split. Some agreed with his assessment. Others insisted it represented coded manipulation from Obama. But the very fact that conservative voices were divided demonstrated how genuinely strange and unexpected the moment had been. Reporters who had witnessed the briefing firsthand began publishing detailed personal accounts, each one echoing the same fundamental disbelief. Headlines carried words like misfire, backfire, and miscalculation. Political observers couldn't recall another instance when a president had attempted to discredit a rival and ended up making them appear significantly stronger. But perhaps the most telling indicator of the shockwave came from the press pool itself. Normally, after a White House briefing, reporters shuffle quickly to their vehicles or workspaces, eager to file their stories and meet deadlines. This time, clusters of them lingered on the steps outside the building, replaying the clip on their phones, debating its meaning and implications. The discussion wasn't about whether Obama looked bad. It was about whether Trump had just orchestrated a political resurrection for his predecessor. Do you think he even realized what he was actually playing? One journalist asked. Another shrugged thoughtfully. Doesn't really matter at this point. Everyone's already interpreting it their own way. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Trump, who had built his political brand on controlling narratives and dominating news cycles, had set the stage for a story he no longer owned. That night, Obama's words found their way into classrooms, workplaces, and family kitchens across America. The press had amplified them, but the public was carrying them forward independently. It wasn't just what he said that resonated. It was how he said it, calmly, thoughtfully, without the theatrical dramatics so common in contemporary politics. At a factory in Akron, a worker named Maria Delgado replayed the clip on her phone during her lunch break. Her co-workers gathered around chewing sandwiches as Obama's voice filled the noisy break room. When the recording ended, one of them sighed deeply. "Man, that's completely different from what we usually hear." Maria nodded in agreement. "It feels like someone actually talking to us, not lecturing at us." The shockwave wasn't yet measurable in polling numbers. It was measured in conversations and casual comments, in the way people were suddenly quoting a man who wasn't even running for any office. But outside that briefing room, the story was gaining unstoppable momentum, and soon the internet would transform those 7 minutes into something even Trump couldn't hope to control. By the time dawn broke over Washington the following day, the clip had already reached millions of Americans. What had begun in a crowded White House briefing room was now in the hands of ordinary people scrolling through their feeds before work students huddled over phones in school hallways and night shift. Workers streaming the video during their break times. Twitter exploded with commentary memes, spread faster than official statements could be written. Someone edited Obama's line, "Leadership isn't about tearing others down," and paired it with a split screen showing Trump at the podium scowling. The video was shared over 300,000 times within just a few hours. A new hashtag emerged, #strength in words, trending across the United States before lunchtime. On TikTok, creative users stitched Obama's calm words over footage of everyday resilience. One particularly popular video showed a single mother in Tulsa packing her children's lunches before heading to her second job, while Obama's voice provided narration. The strength of our country isn't measured by the titles of people in office. It's measured by parents in Milwaukee who work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Viewers flooded the comments section with emotional responses. "This hits harder than any campaign advertisement." Another user wrote, "It's not even political, it's just human," on Instagram Reels. The phenomenon continued. A high school basketball coach in Sacramento uploaded a clip of his players practicing with the Obama recording layered over slow-motion shots of them running drills. His caption read simply, "This is what leadership sounds like within hours." The reel had accumulated tens of thousands of likes and hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories of perseverance. But nowhere was the cultural firestorm more visible than YouTube, where dozens of channels reposted the entire 7-minute recording. Some added commentary, others played it without interruption, but the view counts climbed into the millions. Comment sections became battlegrounds of emotions pouring out in real time. Say what you want about politics, but this man could genuinely speak. One user wrote. Another countered, Don't be fooled by pretty words. Look at his actual record, but the heated back. And fourth only accelerated the clips spread in living rooms across the country. Families found themselves discussing the recording at dinner tables in Columbus, Ohio. 63-year-old Janice Walker played the audio for her grandchildren. "Listen to this," she said, placing her phone on speaker when the words ended. Her 12-year-old granddaughter asked softly, "Why doesn't the current president talk like that?" Janice had no immediate answer. Meanwhile, in a small-town diner in Kansas, truckers, on their morning break, debated the meaning of the tape. One insisted it was evidence that Obama was manipulating impressionable young people. Another shook his head firmly. "No," he muttered, sipping his coffee. That's just what it sounds like when a leader actually believes in people. Their waitress balancing multiple plates chimed in without missing a beat. "Sounds better than anything I've heard in recent years." The clip had evolved beyond a simple piece of audio. It was functioning as a mirror, forcing Americans to confront what they valued in political leadership. For some, it reignited long-dormant admiration. For others, it raised deep suspicion. But one truth was absolutely undeniable. It was getting people talking across every demographic and political divide. Political strategists scrambled to catch up and respond appropriately on conservative talk. Radio hosts urged listeners not to be deceived by eloquent speeches on progressive podcasts. Commentators celebrated that Obama's words were a powerful reminder of what leadership used to sound like. Even late-night television comedians couldn't resist the obvious material. One host joked, "Trump tried to play Obama like a movie villain." But America heard Morgan Freeman narrating a commercial about hope. The studio audience responded with sustained laughter. But the online phenomenon wasn't just about jokes or partisan reactions. Something deeper and more significant was happening across the cultural landscape. Obama's words were being incorporated into motivational videos, quoted in graduation speeches, even printed on homemade posters taped to high school lockers. Teachers played the audio in civics classes, asking students to define what leadership meant to them in churches. Pastors wove his phrases into sermons about perseverance and maintaining faith during difficult times. Trump's communications team attempted damage control, insisting the recording was definitive proof of Obama's ongoing political interference. But their words fell flat amid the chaos of memes and trending hashtags. The internet had already decided the meaning for itself, and that interpretation was beyond any official control. Back in Detroit, where the recording had originally been made, the young leaders who had been present in that room months earlier felt a strange mixture of pride and complete disbelief. 24-year-old Malika Foster, whose Facebook post about the event had already gone viral, told a local television station, "We were just talking about making a positive difference in our neighborhoods. None of us imagined those words would be played in the White House briefing room. Now everyone's discussing it. That feels completely surreal." Her friend Jamal, who had also attended the original gathering, added, "When he said history isn't written by cynics, it felt like he was speaking directly to me personally. And now people everywhere are hearing that message. That means something genuinely important." What Trump had framed as evidence of weakness was now being interpreted by millions as proof of authentic vision. The cultural firestorm wasn't controllable, not by press releases, not by cable news commentary, not even by Trump's own social media posts. By the end of the day, scientific polls hadn't yet been conducted, but public sentiment was clearly shifting. And inside living rooms, classrooms, and offices across America, Obama's words were being repeated, quoted, and analyzed in ways no one, not even Obama himself, could have anticipated. But the true measure of the moment wasn't in online reactions or viral memes. It was in the genuine conversations happening face-to-face across America, where the recording was becoming less a political headline and more a fundamental question about what kind of leadership people actually wanted from their elected officials. The real impact of the recording wasn't measured in hashtags or trending topics. It was measured in the way people paused around kitchen tables, leaned across lunch counters, and sat quietly in living rooms asking each other, "What do you actually think about that recording?" For once, the conversation wasn't confined to Washington political circles or cable news panels. It was happening in Neighborhoods, small towns, and major cities reaching into every corner of everyday American life. In a laundromat in Dayton, Ohio, two women folded clothes side by side, the steady hum of washing machines providing background noise. One pulled out her smartphone, replayed the clip, and shook her head slowly. "I don't care which political side you support," she said, stuffing towels into a plastic basket. "Those words make genuine sense. That's the kind of message I wish my children were hearing more often." The other woman remained skeptical, shrugging as she sorted socks. "Yeah, but beautiful speeches don't pay bills. Actions do still." Even she couldn't deny the words carried a certain undeniable appeal at a diner outside Tulsa. 4 truck drivers crowded into a corner booth. The waitress set down steaming plates of eggs and bacon, while the men debated what they had heard. One of them, Pete, leaned forward earnestly when he said, "History's not written by cynics." That genuinely affected me. Reminded me of my old man who worked at the plant for 40 years and never gave up on anything across from him. Carl smirked dismissively. "You're getting soft. Pete, that guy talks nice, but talking isn't the same as leading." Yet, even Carl couldn't hide the way his eyes kept returning to the television in the corner as the clip replayed for what seemed like the 10th time that morning. In a high school classroom in Fresno, a history teacher paused her planned lesson, pulled up the video on the smart board, and played it for her students. The classroom fell unusually quiet. A few whispered to each other as Obama's voice filled the space when the recording ended. The teacher asked simply, "So what does authentic leadership sound like to you, a boy?" In the back raised his hand tentatively. "It sounds like someone actually cares whether we succeed or fail." Another student added thoughtfully, "It's not about politics. It's about believing people can make a difference." For the remainder of the class period, they engaged in genuine debate, some skeptical, some inspired, but all actively participating in a discussion that felt meaningful. In homes where political conversations often devolved into heated arguments, the recording became a rare pause button for reflection in Madison, Wisconsin. The Whitaker family sat around their dinner table, plates half empty, as Obama's voice came through their television speakers afterward. Their teenage daughter observed quietly, "That doesn't sound unfit. That sounds steady and reassuring." Her father, a lifelong Republican supporter, grumbled under his breath, but didn't launch into his usual passionate rebuttal. He stabbed his fork into his mashed potatoes and muttered, "Steady doesn't automatically mean correct." But the absence of his typical fiery response spoke more eloquently than words could express. Barbershops, beauty salons, grocery store checkout lines. The conversation played out everywhere across America. People weren't universally agreeing, but they were genuinely listening, and that fact alone carried significant meaning for many Americans. It wasn't even specifically about Obama. It was about remembering a tone, a style of leadership that felt absent from the current political moment. Late night diners in Albuquerque heard older veterans sharing stories about speeches that had sustained them through difficult decades. On the subway in Boston, a young woman played the audio on her phone speaker, and the strangers packed shoulder to shoulder around her grew quiet, some closing their eyes, allowing the voice to wash over them, as if it were more than politics, as if it were a reminder of something they hadn't realized they missed. But the reaction wasn't uniformly positive. Anger surfaced in various places too. In Fort Worth, a group of men at the local VFW hall erupted when the clip aired again on the television. One slammed his beer bottle down so hard foam spilled across the wooden table. "This is complete garbage," he declared. Angrily, "They're trying to make him into some kind of saint. He's not one of us, never was." His friend, quieter by nature, stirred his black coffee thoughtfully and replied, "Maybe not, but you have to admit the man knows how to communicate. That's exactly why people pay attention." The exchange nearly escalated into a shouting match before the bartender intervened, muttering that politics always seemed to ruin perfectly good evenings. The cultural divide was real and visible, but the deeper truth remained. Undeniable, people were reacting emotionally. They weren't ignoring it, changing channels, or scrolling past mindlessly. They were pausing to consider, and in a country where attention spans had become fractured and news cycles lasted mere hours, that pause represented something powerful happening beneath the surface. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, some of the very young leaders who had been present when the speech was first delivered were fielding calls from national media outlets. Malika Foster, who had already posted her reaction, found herself being interviewed on NPR. It didn't feel like he was talking to us because we were special. She explained carefully, it felt like he was reminding us that everyone matters. That's why it's affecting so many people now, because it wasn't about him. It was about all of us. Her friend Jamal added during another interview, "We didn't applaud because he was a former president. We applauded because he was being honest and genuine. That's incredibly rare. In politics and in living rooms far removed from Detroit, people who had never particularly cared about political speeches were replaying the words sometimes aloud, sometimes just for themselves. The recording wasn't fading into the typical news cycle, it was spreading and deepening. But as Americans were analyzing and debating its meaning, the real political consequences were beginning to crystallize. And inside the White House, Trump's inner circle was feeling the mounting pressure of a strategic gamble that was rapidly turning against them. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was far from the celebratory mood that had been anticipated. What had been carefully planned as a decisive strike against Barack Obama was rapidly mutating into something completely different. By late afternoon, the West Wing buzzed with aides rushing between offices, cell phones pressed urgently to their ears, voices sharp with barely contained panic. In the Roosevelt Room, a hastily organized emergency meeting was already underway. Senior advisors sat around the polished conference table, laptops open, some displaying news channels, streaming silently on their screens, the image of Obama's words, scrolling beneath headlines like "political backfire" and "Obama sounds presidential again," was impossible to ignore. "Mr. President," one advisor began with careful deliberation, "the media coverage isn't aligning with the message we intended to send." Trump leaned back in his leather chair, arms folded tightly across his chest, his face flushed with visible frustration. "It's fake news, all of it," he declared. "They'll twist absolutely anything I give them. I showed them definitive proof and they're acting like it makes him look good. It's completely disgraceful." Younger aide scrolled frantically through her smartphone, her expression increasingly concerned. "Sir, it's not just the traditional networks. Social media is running with this in ways we didn't anticipate. Hashtags, memes, TikTok videos, the clip has gone viral, but it's framing Obama as the mature voice in the room." Trump slammed his palm against the table, making pens and water glasses rattle. "Viral for all the wrong reasons," he shouted. "They should be discussing how he's inappropriately meddling, not about how pleasant his voice sounds. You people don't understand how to control a narrative." The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Several staffers exchanged cautious glances but kept their eyes focused on their notes. No one wanted to become the target of Trump's escalating frustration. Meanwhile, across town, cable news networks were dissecting the political fallout in real time on CNN. Analysts displayed the recording side by side with Trump's increasingly agitated commentary, contrasting Obama's measured words with Trump's defensive reaction. One political strategist shook her head in disbelief. This was supposed to be a devastating hammer, but it turned into a spotlight. It highlighted Obama's composure instead of any alleged wrongdoing. Fox News anchors attempted to frame the narrative differently, suggesting the speech represented evidence of Obama inappropriately inserting himself into current political affairs. But even there, the internal division was noticeable. One commentator admitted with visible reluctance the words themselves don't sound like undermining, they sound like encouragement, and that's what people are responding to in the Situation Room. One of Trump's most trusted advisors finally spoke up. "Sir, with all due respect, this wasn't the right recording to use if we had previewed it more carefully." Trump cut him off with sharp irritation. "Don't blame me for this. Somebody told me this was political gold. Somebody said this would prove he was weak if it doesn't look that way. It's because the media is protecting him, like they always do." No one dared respond directly, but the evidence of complete backfire was undeniable by evening. Polls from rapid overnight surveys flashed across television screens. Obama's favorability ratings had jumped 5 points in a single day, among independent voters. The number was even higher. The clip had humanized him to voters who had grown distant or indifferent over time. In living rooms across the country, political pundits debated whether Trump had fundamentally underestimated how Obama's voice still resonated with ordinary Americans. "It's not about partisan politics," one analyst explained. "It's about tone and delivery. People are genuinely starved for someone who sounds calm, steady, and reassuring. The fact that Trump delivered that voice to them himself, that's political irony at its most devastating," inside the West Wing aides whispered, anxiously about strategy. Should they double down, framing Obama's words as political meddling? Or should they pivot, completely drop the story, and move to the next headline? Both options carried significant risk dropping. It might make Trump appear defeated. Doubling down might cause the clip to spread even further. In the press briefing room, Trump's press secretary faced a relentless barrage of questions. If this recording was supposed to prove Obama's unfitness, why does it sound like a motivational speech? One reporter demanded. The press secretary dodged, skillfully pivoting to discuss Trump's economic record, but the question hung in the air like an accusation. Later that night, Trump himself returned to Twitter, hammering out a flurry of posts, accusing the media of romanticizing Obama and ignoring what he called clear evidence of weakness. But his words didn't trend nationally. The clip did. And while the political establishment argued endlessly, the broader public kept sharing the recording in increasingly unexpected places. It wasn't just political accounts or news enthusiasts anymore. A fitness coach in Denver used it as a soundtrack for a motivational post. A pastor in rural Ohio incorporated Obama's words into his Sunday sermon. A local band in St. Louis remixed the clip into a song that rapidly climbed SoundCloud charts. Trump's communications team could spin relentlessly, but the reality was painfully clear. The recording had escaped their control completely. It was no longer a political weapon. It had become a cultural moment. By midnight, an exhausted aide slumped into a chair outside the Oval Office and muttered to a passing colleague, "We gave him a platform, and he turned it into a pulpit." The colleague shook, her head whispering back, "No, we gave him a platform and the people turned it into one." But just as the White House struggled desperately to contain the expanding fallout, all attention began turning toward Chicago, where Obama himself was expected to respond, and his words could potentially tilt the scales even further in his favor. Chicago's South Side had grown accustomed to occasional media attention whenever Barack Obama returned home. But this situation was dramatically different. By the third day after Trump's press conference, camera crews lined the sidewalks outside the Obama Foundation headquarters. Reporters braced against the chilly wind off Lake Michigan, waiting for any word from the former president. Inside, Obama sat in a modest conference room jacket, removed sleeves rolled neatly at his wrists. Aides hovered nearby, fielding constant phone calls from journalists and political allies who wanted to know how he planned to respond. He had watched the clip spread across social media with the same calm detachment that had characterized his presidency. He hadn't asked for viral fame, but he understood why it had happened. "Mr. President," one aide said carefully, "the networks are running this story continuously. Social media is framing it as a leadership contrast. If you don't say something soon, they'll create the narrative for you." Obama leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled thoughtfully. "If I do respond, it can't be about me," he said quietly. "It has to be about the country, about what we owe each other." For 2 days, speculation had swirled intensely. Would he attack Trump directly? Would he dismiss the controversy entirely, or would he let the moment pass, leaving interpretation to the public? When he finally decided, the announcement was characteristically understated. A simple press release. Obama would make a brief statement from his Chicago home, streamed online for anyone to watch. No grand event, no flashy publicity buildup, just a man speaking directly into a camera that evening. As the clock struck 8 p.m., millions tuned in. Families huddled in living rooms, college students watched on laptops, and truck drivers streamed it from phones balanced on dashboards at highway rest stops. The screen faded, in to reveal Obama sitting at a simple wooden desk, the faint outline of bookshelves visible behind him. He began with that unmistakable calm tone over the past few days, A recording of mine has been shared widely. It wasn't intended for the world stage. It was a conversation with young leaders in Detroit, a reminder to them that their voices matter. But now that it's public, I want to take a moment to speak to all of you." He paused, allowing the silence to work as effectively as his words. "What you heard on that recording wasn't a political strategy or an attack on anyone. It was simply the truth. As I understand it, that America grows stronger when we lift each other up, that democracy only functions when we believe in one another, that leadership isn't measured by how loudly we speak, but by how carefully we listen." Across the country, viewers leaned forward in Cleveland. A retired teacher turned up the volume on her television in Phoenix. A group of college students sat cross-legged on a dormitory floor listening with unusual focus in Atlanta. A father muted his phone and quieted his children, wanting to hear every word. Obama continued his cadence, deliberate and steady. "I know these are polarized times. I know people don't always agree with me, and that's perfectly okay. But when leaders use moments of division to score political points, everybody loses. My message has always been simple. We don't move forward by tearing each other down. We move forward by lifting one another up." He didn't mention Trump's name, not once. He didn't need to. The contrast was crystal clear without it. Then he leaned slightly closer to the camera. "I want to speak, especially to the young people who may be hearing my words for the first time outside of a classroom or a news clip. Don't let cynicism convince you that your voice doesn't matter. Don't let anyone tell you that democracy is someone else's responsibility. It belongs to you, to all of us." The address lasted less than 8 minutes. No theatrical elements, no raised voice, no visible anger, just a quiet, pointed reminder of the message that had carried him into office years earlier. When he finished, he closed simply, "That's all I wanted to say, thank you, and keep believing in each other." The live stream ended. No questions, no dramatic flourishes, just silence. But across the nation, that silence was immediately filled with conversation in diners. People applauded quietly at the screens above the counter. In dormitory rooms, students replayed the clip and recorded reaction videos on social media. New hashtags, multiplied. "Keep believing" trended within the hour. Even some political critics grudgingly admitted the restraint was remarkable. A conservative columnist in Dallas wrote, "I disagree with Obama on most policy issues, but I'll admit that was one of the most disciplined responses I've ever witnessed. He didn't attack. He didn't grandstand. He just reminded people of what they miss." Meanwhile, inside the White House, aides watched the live stream. Intense silence. One turned to another and whispered, "That's it. That's all he had to do. 8 minutes, and he's completely reclaimed the narrative." Trump himself was reportedly furious, pacing between offices, demanding to know why networks were replaying Obama's address continuously. But by then, the affair story wasn't his to control anymore. If Obama's calm response had reshaped the narrative, the consequences were only beginning, and in the days that followed, polls, donors, and voters would send signals that rattled Trump's political organization even more severely. By the morning after Obama's brief address, the numbers began speaking louder than any pundit. Quick turnaround polls conducted by several major outlets showed a noticeable shift among independent voters. The very demographic both parties constantly pursued, Obama's favorability ratings had surged. One poll even showed a 12-point jump among Americans under 35, who said the recording made them feel more hopeful about the future. At first, the White House attempted to dismiss the data. Trump's press secretary stepped to the podium with her usual confidence, insisting the former president is attempting to manipulate the American people with flowery speeches. The current president is focused on delivering real results. But as she spoke, a reporter raised her hand. If that's accurate, why are Trump's approval numbers declining in the overnight polling data? Her smile faltered visibly, and the briefing ended abruptly. In living rooms across the country, voters who hadn't paid serious attention to politics in years suddenly found themselves engaged in political discussions again. In Pittsburgh, a retired steelworker told a local reporter, "I don't care who you vote for, when a man speaks like that, it stirs something deep inside you." In Seattle, a young entrepreneur posted a video saying, I wasn't old enough to vote for him, but hearing that made me realize what leadership used to feel like. Meanwhile, Trump's major donors were growing increasingly restless. Behind closed doors at a Manhattan fundraising event, several wealthy backers whispered about the expanding fallout. One leaned across a polished oak table and muttered quietly, "We can't afford strategic mistakes like this. The optics are terrible." Another replied grimly, "Optics, this represents genuine erosion. Every time he attacks, he gives the other guy more oxygen." Cable networks seized on the developing narrative, feeding it in endless loops. MSNBC framed Obama's response as steady leadership. CNN called it a contrast moment. Even Fox News found itself internally divided, with one anchor reluctantly admitting the restraint worked effectively. He didn't need to say much to come out on top. The ripple effects stretched into Congress. Several Republican lawmakers privately expressed frustration that the episode had been an unexpected gift to Democrats. One aide leaked to a reporter that there were growing concerns about the president's political instincts. The leak generated headlines of its own. But the backlash wasn't limited to political elites. At a coffee shop in Milwaukee, a group of young professionals discussed the fallout over expensive lattes. One said, "I'm not even particularly interested in politics, but the difference is obvious." One guy shouts constantly. The other guy reminds you why you should care. Another chimed in thoughtfully. It's like a job interview. One candidate rants and complains. The other speaks with calm authority. Who would you hire? Heads nodded around the table. In agreement on the streets of Philadelphia, a small rally formed spontaneously. People carried signs with Obama's words written in bold marker. "History is not written by cynics." A local news crew captured footage of a grandmother holding a placard. With the phrase, "Keep believing," she smiled warmly into the camera and said, "He's not even running for anything, but he's giving us hope again." Inside the West Wing, the mood grew darker by the hour. Advisors drafted new talking points, tried desperately to spin the clip as proof of political interference, but none of it gained traction. Aides whispered in hallways that the president was furious beyond reason. One source described him pacing in the Oval Office, muttering that the media was conspiring to crown Obama all over again. Late-night television comedians sharpened their satirical knives on one show. The host played the clip side by side with Trump's angry tweets. The punchline landed perfectly. It's like someone tried to play a scary movie, but accidentally hit the motivational playlist on Spotify. The audience erupted in sustained laughter. By the next morning, the joke itself was trending on social media. But beneath the humor, something serious was shifting across America. Ordinary citizens were beginning to discuss not just Obama's words, but the broader question: what kind of leadership did they actually want? Did they prefer the constant confrontation or the calm reassurance they had just been reminded of? A political science professor at the University of Michigan summarized it perfectly. In an op-ed, Trump intended to expose Obama. Instead, he exposed the hunger Americans still have for leaders who remind them of their better selves in doing so. He gave Obama what politicians crave most: sustained relevance. The fallout spread internationally. European outlets framed it as Obama's surprise return to the global spotlight. Canadian newspapers noted the irony of Trump unintentionally elevating his rival. The story was no longer confined to American borders, it had become international news. By the end of the week, whispers in Washington grew increasingly loud. Was Obama preparing to step back into the political arena? In some capacity, his aides dismissed the speculation, insisting he had no interest in returning to electoral politics. Still, the rumors refused to die down. Inside the White House, one exhausted advisor finally muttered to a colleague, "We gave him a second act without meaning to." The colleague replied grimly, "And the worst part is he didn't even ask for one." But while the political fallout rattled Trump's organization, the deeper impact of the moment wasn't measured in polls or headlines. It was in the quiet lesson people were absorbing about the difference between tearing down and building up. The dust of politics has a way of settling into background noise. Most controversies spark, flare brightly, then fade into the relentless churn of the next news cycle. But this one lingered with unusual persistence. The image of Trump slamming the laptop shut in frustration, paired with the calm cadence of Obama's words still echoing across the country, stayed alive longer than anyone had predicted. What made it endure wasn't just the political rivalry, it wasn't just Democrats celebrating or Republicans expressing frustration. It was the fact that ordinary people, families in small towns, students in crowded classrooms, retirees in quiet suburbs, found themselves pausing for a genuine moment to ask, what does authentic leadership actually sound like? In Miami, a Cuban-American grandfather sat on his front porch rocking slowly as his granddaughter replayed the recording on her phone when it ended. She asked him thoughtfully, "Abuelo, why are people arguing?" About this, he considered for a moment and said, "Because when someone speaks to the heart, even their enemies can't control the response." That was the unshakable truth Trump had intended to bury Obama. But in doing so, he accidentally amplified a message that transcended partisan politics. The speech wasn't flashy. It wasn't even intended for national broadcast, yet its authenticity was exactly why it struck so deeply. In Detroit, where the words had first been spoken, the young leaders who had heard them in person still felt a profound sense of pride. Malika, now something of a local voice thanks to her viral posts, told a community gathering, "What I realized this week is that leadership doesn't always mean winning arguments. Sometimes it just means reminding people that they matter." Heads nodded across the room, not because they all agreed with her political positions, but because they understood the fundamental sentiment. Even critics grudgingly admitted the moment had undeniable power. Conservative radio host in Ohio told his listeners, "Look, I don't support the guy's policies, but if you're honest about it, the way he handled this situation, it's hard to say it didn't land effectively." The phone lines lit up immediately with callers, arguing, some furious others conceding the same point. But the fact that people were genuinely wrestling with it spoke volumes. What happened that week revealed more about America than about either political figure. It demonstrated how quickly a narrative could backfire when driven by anger instead of vision. It showed how words meant for encouragement could outlive their original moment, taking root in places no one expected. And above all, it proved that sometimes strength isn't measured by volume, but by calm conviction. In the days that followed, columnists reached for metaphors to describe the phenomenon. Some called it a political boomerang. Others said Trump had lit a match in the darkness, only to reveal someone else holding the torch. But outside the headlines, in the quiet spaces where ordinary people live their daily lives, the lesson was simpler. At a church in Indianapolis, a pastor summarized it perfectly in his Sunday sermon. "Tearing down your neighbor may make you feel strong for a moment, but lifting them up makes you remembered forever." That's what had happened. Trump's attack didn't define Obama. It defined Trump by contrast. Obama's words reminded people of something they had been missing: steadiness, reassurance, a voice that believed in them more than it believed in itself. The moral was clear, even for those who resisted it. When leaders use their platform to divide, they might win the moment, but they lose the people. When they use it to encourage, their words last far beyond the applause. Weeks later, as the frenzy gradually cooled, the recording was still being quoted. High school seniors incorporated it into graduation speeches. Coaches taped excerpts to locker room walls. Families referenced it in everyday conversation. It had outlived its intended audience and become part of the collective public memory. In the end, that was the ultimate irony. Trump had tried to strip Obama of political relevance. Instead, he had given him the one thing even time struggles to erase: genuine resonance for the millions who listened, whether they agreed with him or not. The lesson was unmistakable. Strength isn't proven by calling others unfit. It's proven by showing people why they matter and reminding them not to give up on each other. So maybe that's where the real story ends. Not in the press room, not in the hashtags, not in the shouting on cable news. It ends in the question the moment left behind. What kind of leadership do we want to follow? And for viewers like you, that's the takeaway worth holding on to. Because whether you lean left, right, or somewhere in between, the lesson is universal. Words can tear down or words can build up. One lasts only for a headline. The other lasts for a generation. If you took something from this story, remember, there will always be more moments like these. More lessons, tucked inside the political noise, and if you want to keep hearing stories that cut through the chaos and leave you thinking, long after the video ends, make sure to subscribe to Saturday, because sometimes the most powerful surprises aren't in what's said against someone, but in what's revealed about all of us.